Yeah.
Okay. Oh, wait. Almost good. Oh, there's Astrid. Hi, Astrid, can you hear us?
I can. Hello.
Great. Do we have anybody else online? We, do you have a couple people that are in the attendee section? There's a column. Section. We have, paper over here is one of our BSC reps. Hey. Do you want to join us at the table or just observing? Oh, sure. Why don't we start with introductions? I'm Karen Bradshaw, Executive Assistant.
Eddie Wong, board.
Julia Brim Edwards, Board and Committee Member.
Liz Large, Contracted General Counsel.
Rachel Lang, Paralegal.
Emily Courtnage, Director of Purchasing and Contracting.
Piper Stolting, District Student Council representative.
Which school are you representing?
Grant High School.
Awesome.
Astrid, Robin, Franklin, alternate student rep.
Great. Thanks, students, for joining us after school today. We're going to start today's meeting with the public contracting rules policy. And this is one that we've been carried for the last, we had an initial conversation prior in October, and then because we didn't have any committee meetings in November, we're now bringing it back, but there's some sense of urgency because we'd like to get this implemented or first read and it's public commented and hopefully implemented in January. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily to share the highlights of the 195 page policy that you're suggesting we adopt.
Yeah.
So just a reminder that this is not an all new policy. Most of the 190 pages have existed now for 10 years or more, actually. These the public contracting rules are agency administrative rules that follow the Oregon Public Contracting Code, which is statute. We, for the most part, adopt the Attorney General's model rules. So most of our rules mirror exactly the Attorney General model rules. That's how make sure we're consistent with how other agencies procure goods and services. There have been legislative changes this last legislative session, and so we're trying to bring our own rules in compliance and in alignment with those new legislative changes that go into effect January 1st, 2024. So the urgency is that we want to bring our own rules into alignment as soon as possible after that date so that we can be purchasing and contracting as efficiently as possible. I'll go through the memo really briefly, but we did take out a few suggested changes that touch on the board's oversight or involvement. So we took out all of those. So that's the difference between what you saw in October and now. And we'll address those at another time. But for now, the changes we left in place are those that will bring us in alignment with new law. So again, the first set, new competitive procurement thresholds. So those are the thresholds for different types of purchases at which we must seek 3 quotes or for larger purchases, go out for a full request for proposals or invitation to bid publicly posted. There are several updates for goods and services, construction that we want to adopt. Again, the state adopted those and we want to get in alignment with the state. We also want to bring our personal services threshold into alignment with the goods and services threshold that the state has adopted. There are a number of other language changes. You'll see very minor language updates throughout the whole 190 pages. Again, that's just bringing us in alignment with slight changes in the model rules so that we share the same language. A few other, you can see in section 1B of my memo, a few other very minor changes, including one that will allow, and again, this is a state statute and Attorney General model rule change that will allow for public hearings for exemptions from competitive bidding to only be held if requested. That change makes sense to us because in all the years that we've advertised public hearings, we've never had a single person show up to them. So instead, we'll advertise the opportunity to request a public hearing. Let's see. I am also suggesting that we raise the threshold for personal services contracts at which we must get 3 quotes in formal procurement process from $50,000 to $75,000. We would be raising the upper limit at which we must do a formal RFP from 150 to 250. And we suggest that there should also be a change at the lower for the 3 quote threshold. And that is in part because that $50,000 threshold has been in place for well over 10 years. Obviously, there have been some inflation in place. Buying power of 50,000 is no longer what it was. So we're going to suggest a change there. Another change, again, to bring us in alignment with model rules, is to remove the amendment cap that we have in our rules for personal services contracts. So this was added in 2016. It is not something that is in statute or in model rules. We have found it to be ineffective and not very workable since then. In an example that I included in the memo is there's a very small contract for professional service or performances at a school, professional development sessions, and the school decides to want to add one more session. And if that extra session would kick the total contract price over 125% of the initial price, that amendment is not allowed. Instead, the school would have to initiate a new contract. In the end, same result, but a very inefficient process. And then finally, a couple new exception rules. One is to allow direct negotiation of medical services. We borrowed language from Metro for this exception. It is what we do in practice already, but right now we have to rely on a more general direct negotiation rule that requires some paperwork to prove the applicability of the exception. So we'd like to put in place just a new rule to allow direct negotiation of medical services. And then finally, some very small updates to a couple of our exception rules, one for copyrighted materials and creative works available from only one source, one to our software and hardware maintenance licenses, subscriptions and upgrades exceptions. So both of those, again, allow procurement without competition in certain circumstances. We want to modernize the language. Those have been around for quite some time to make sure that they cover not just textbooks or traditional texts basically, but also digital resources, because as we've seen a switch over time to a lot of our curriculum being digitally based. And make sure that we're more clearly covering also cloud-based programs and applications. So those are just language modernization issues. All of these changes improve the efficiency of our internal processes within PPS and will not only benefit my department in our oversight role in the purchasing process, but all of the internal departments who need to engage in these competitive processes and paperwork. So we're looking to reduce paperwork and access the new efficiencies that the state law has allowed.
Quick questions. Hopefully quick. the amendment cap
Yes.
request. Would that, I mean, that's currently with the 150, but would that be changed or did still apply if it was raised to 250?
So the 150 that I talk about in that example there is talking about the board approval threshold. So the board approval threshold, we are not seeking a change to that threshold at this time.
I think the question is a different question.
Oh,
Yeah, maybe not.
Because on that, and this having to do the new contracts, is that the one? you're saying?
yeah, so if we increase the threshold to 250,000, right? Would the amendment cap be the same? Would that be altered? It would still,
So right now we have an amendment cap that again, I'm looking to get rid of altogether. So it artificially sort of caps our ability to amend contracts at 125% of the original price. That's really a completely different question than procurement thresholds. So say you have think about this. Okay, construction contracts, currently you need to do a formally advertised invitation to bid if it's above 100,000. Actually, that's a bad example because the amendment caps is only in personal services contracts. So let me think of a different example. So right. So right now, if you wanted to amend, like I say here, $120,000 personal services contract, you want to amend it for 35,000. Add 35,000. That would bring you to 155,000, and it is above that 125% amendment cap. So you couldn't do it. But here's the other thing. The other reason you couldn't do it is if you hadn't procured that contract with a formal procurement process, so a formal RFP, you can't amend into territory where you're not allowed to go because you didn't use the procurement process that would support that. If that threshold's raised to 250, you could amend from 120 to 155. And if only if we get rid of the amendment cap, however. But
The reason, like, under that example, if you had the 35,000, you'd have to actually do a whole new contract because it's over 125% of the base contract. So it means you have to do these serial.
Right, you end up doing serial contracts, and it sort of an inadvertent effect is that you can. We don't want to see it happen, but folks could inadvertently sort of avoid those procurement thresholds that put a hard stop on how far you can go with a contract because you, again, have to meet the procurement method that you hit.
sense. And then the Oregon Public Contracting Code. Could you educate me more a little bit about that? Is that like who is that written for? Just all public entities?
Yes, it governs purchasing at any public agency, public entity within Oregon. We all have to abide by the Oregon Public Contracting Code. So those are the statutes that govern different kinds of purchasing, whether goods and services, construction, architecture, engineering. Then there's the rules that we get to develop. Again, there's a set of model rules coming out of those statutes. And we like to adopt those and align to those. We could modify our rules and do something very different as long as it adheres to the statute. But generally that's not recommended because you want your vendors to sort of understand the same rules apply no matter which agency they're working.
Thank you for explaining.
Sure.
Still big learning curve for contracting stuff. It's all new to me.
It's a lot. It's one of the most exciting things about being a book.
Yeah, buying stuff. I'm buying stuff. Okay. That's all the questions I have.
Do you have other questions? Okay.
Yeah.
And we had just a question about the personal service contracts, from 50 to 75. That seems low. Is that like a standard for a district our size?
So It's interesting that the Oregon Public Contracting Code does not specifically address personal services contracts. Nor do the Attorney General model rules. The rule there is we can either adopt the goods and standard services rule, or we can adopt our own rules. So every agency does it a little differently. One I'm aware of, Beaverton School District has long had a 75,000 threshold. So under 75, in their case, you can go direct for any kind of professional service, but above 75, you have an informal process unless one of the direct negotiation exceptions applies. For example, we have a direct negotiation exception for legal services, no competition. So it's hard to say because some agencies have adopted their own personal services rules and some haven't. But again, ours hasn't been modified since I think I looked at that. I think that was 2010 or so. So it's been quite a while.
Do you think that's the right amount? I mean,
I think it is,
seems
Liz
slow.
and I did a little exercise with the consumer price index calculator, and it seemed like it brought it into line with what 50,000 was when that was originally adopted.
And then the direct negotiation of medical services. Is there a reason why? It sounds like there's a good reason to have it be, to go to direct negotiation, but I'm wondering, was there a reason why it was the other way?
We had never adopted a specific rule about it, but we do have, as I cite there, rules about allowing direct negotiation even over the normal competitive threshold when there's unique knowledge or expertise, in a specialized service area. So what we're doing is just putting medical services under that category. But again, it just requires some explanation paperwork. We did the same thing a few years ago. We used to have all that exception paperwork for legal services. And then we finally just recognized that this is how we are procuring things and probably the right way to do it, given the unique nature of the services and how so much depends on the individual providing them. And so we finally just adopted a rule that provided that efficiency without the paperwork. So that's what this is.
That's all the questions I have. Do you have any questions?
No, it's a bit above what I can understand, but I mean, as times change, it's important to update our policies, so I can understand that part.
Astrid, do you have any questions?
No, I agree with Piper.
And as Emily said, we had a conversation last week because we lost the month of November for committee meetings. And because we want to move this, we're going to move this specific piece, but we'll have a placeholder next spring to talk about some of the other pieces that were not they're sort of aligned, I guess, with the changes being made here, but they're not the ones that need to be made to be able to align with the model rule, contract rule. And there are things like issues related to services, certified businesses, board of building, and it seemed like that would be a longer conversation. And we want to move this, but we'll put a placeholder on the agenda this spring.
Okay.
So with that, any issue with moving this out to the the full board for recommendation for introduction?
Yeah, and it's just the stuff that was mentioned in the memo, right?
Right.
Right. Yeah, I'm good with that.
Even I am gonna rely on stacking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where I'm at. I think it needs a bigger discussion, but I don't want to block it here.
Yeah, it seems like this would be, I say, if we'd had time in November. So, but we'll definitely bring it back.
Okay.
So we'll, thanks, Kara, if we could have this, for the first read, at the first meeting in January.
January 9th. January 9th.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen.
All right, thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
So the next policy we're going to discuss is the ethics and conflict of interest policy. And we at the last meeting went through it section by section, and I think it was general directional agreement with the draft. There were just a couple of places where we had some conceptual language changes, so that we didn't recommend them, but I think they were very, very close. So this meeting is really designed to go through the additional changes from last meeting, make sure that we're okay with them, and then send it out if we're ready to send it out. And I think the draft doesn't have page numbers on it, so it looks like the first change from the last version. So just as a backup, it looks fairly clean because this is actually a new policy. Versus revision from versus revision. So on page 4, this is under the section of conflicts of interest. B. So originally we had that if you had developed something even employees could not claim, promote, or sell instructional training or the materials developed on district time or district property. Normally they promote or sell instructional training or the materials they developed on their own district. And at the time, the head of IT happened to be on the call and gave an example of a circumstance in which somebody, before they came to the district, developed something, and it was like an app, and that it was something that some individuals in the district wanted to use, and so we wouldn't want to necessarily deny the district access to something that might be useful just because it had been developed by somebody who was from the district. So the language was added. There may be exceptional circumstances the district chooses to consider. I'm not quite sure if that's enough. So then do we disclose it?
And I apologize that I wasn't here at the November
Yeah.
30 meeting for the discussion. I would say as a language, just the language is a little vague. It's not clear who's gonna do what and who's gonna choose and who's acting in the district.
Is there a second set of the clause that could add less?
Again, I apologize, I wasn't here. Can you tell me again how you,
So,
the kind of circumstance we need to.
so for example, we were like, we don't think it's a good practice if somebody, like, say, writes a book on whatever their subject matter expertise is, and then they're at the district and be like, oh, I think we should buy that for all the, people in this cluster or people who have this topic area, because it would be, or if it was written by somebody who was in a position of overseeing other people making those decisions, there might be like a sense of like, you need to use something. So we'd say, no, we don't. I think that should be prohibited. And like I said, Don used an example of an app that Kevin Crutchett had developed, that when teachers did, or principals did like walkthroughs, that they would like enter data into. And he's like, some people wanted to use it. And so just because it had been developed by somebody in the district, so like, well, there may be exceptional circumstances, but so I thought there was something specifically.
So I think who would be the decision maker of those exceptional circumstances is one of the questions.
Is that could be something that, is outlined in an AD? Or can you just,
It could be. I don't know that there was a contemplated AD for this policy, but there always,
Okay.
we can always have one. So if that's the way you'd like staff to work.
well, maybe
together.
it's not even an AD, you could just say that there may be exceptional circumstances the district chooses to, consider, you know, based on something like, teachers. The superintendent. It seems like the most basic thing involved here is that there be some criteria and that there be some.
But other than the written consent of the superintendent that used to be in here, and that was a pretty nice discrete kick out that said it gets the highest level of attention
Well,
on this rare circumstance.
How about just getting rid of the word out? So just keep the sentence going. The district chooses to consider with the written consent of the superintendent.
Sure. I think that works.
Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Then, in section.
Since we're talking about language, just to, since we don't.
Yeah, no,
Nobody
that's-
stuff takes time. It's really, the written consent of the superintendent isn't to consider exceptional circumstances, it's to authorize the use. It's, based on, exceptional circumstances.
So we just need a sentence, like a clause between the consider and the.
Yes.
Would it just be easier just to say there may be exceptions? That can
Exception,
be.
That must be
considered?
approved,
but
receive written
with the written
consent. Of the-
consent, any exceptions based on exceptional circumstances
Right.
must be approved.
I mean, there's so many situations where there would be exceptions where it would just help everybody. I mean, because, the main issue of. This rule is if there's conflicts of interest or, like. Issues of power and authority, right? But there's also so many times where those aren't issues and. Like it wouldn't necessarily be
Because those conflict issues are still in
unethical to
play.
do so. Yeah,
The
right.
decision maker can't benefit from the decision even
Right,
with
exactly.
this, right? So,
Like it just makes sense to have a open door saying like, yeah, exceptions, but as long as it's reviewed by. People.
but if we said exceptions, these are the things what Julia just said, exceptions may be granted. Under exceptional circumstances with the written consent of the superintendent. Straight
At the
up.
top, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, then. Also in that same section, under use of district time. We talked about. District employees, not being able to perform any duties related to an outside job during their regular schedule or after working hours. And then we talked about, well, if somebody took. If they're an employee who receives vacation, that they. Could use it on vacation, so, the language that got added is unless the leave is approved pursuant to district procedures, so there's clear rules around. Personal leaves, around vacation,
Mhm.
so
Sense to me.
does that work for you?
Yeah.
Astrid, anything?
No, sounds good.
Okay, and then. Under. Complaints. My recollection is complaints against, that this is like the language that is in our. Complaints policy.
That
So,
was taken out.
yeah, so
Yeah.
we felt like, I was like, this language goes so familiar.
Yeah, I think you drafted it a few years ago.
So we were thinking it wasn't really need it because it's already somewhere else. But the section now would just be for employees. And then just for clarity and for just for the record, I have been asked, like, what is the sort of discipline for employees who take an action where there's a conflict of interest? And I don't know, this for the record, do you want to just share what the answer is? Because people are like, well, there's nothing in the policy that says like what the discipline is, but obviously in most of our policies, if they're violated, we don't have the actual discipline in the policy.
Right, I think when there's misconduct, there's an assessment made of the severity of the misconduct and prior misconduct. So it goes, there's an assessment, and it's not progressive discipline for non-represented employees. The collective bargaining agreements do have progressive discipline built in, but in both circumstances, there's a reality of taking into account severity and prior. And it could range from a written warning to dismissal, depending on those factors.
So just because it doesn't say what discipline is, doesn't mean it's okay to do, and there's no consequences.
That is exactly correct.
Okay.
Can I ask for one other cleanup?
Yes.
While we're here, I would, because this was modified, I would take out this employee title because it's kind of redundant. So 7.
Oh, just have it be a freestanding.
So that makes sense.
And then in the last section, it's on, actually the title probably should change, maybe to board members and senior leadership. That the annual training, so for example, the board just had theirs last week or in the last couple of weeks. And then we sign a form saying that we've had our training and that we've understand the rules and we'll follow them. I'm just noticing this last sentence is only board members. Are we having senior staff do that as well?
It's feel of the committee like that to be in.
Say it again, what was that?
Oh,
What was it?
so we've added senior staff taking the training, and then board members then certified in writing position the training to have senior staff do that as well.
Again,
Okay.
I suggest one other small change. Board members and senior district staff members shall complete district sponsored training ethics, including conflicts of interest, public meetings, and public policy. Those
Okay.
are
So-
categories of the ethics. Training. Ethics isn't separate.
I think that's it. Is anything else related to the policy?
No, looks good.
I have one question regarding the removal of the complaints section. Would that completely eliminate the possibility of someone filing a complaint and the need that some sort of ethics violation was made?
Against a board member?
Yeah,
So there is another policy, the complaints policy.
Okay.
Where it has this exact same language in here. And we had a long discussion, when we we revised the complaint policy several times. A question of like, what happens when there's complaints against board members, or like who holds them accountable? And, what's written here is what is in the complaints policy. So it's not that you can't complain, it's just, this is somewhere else.
okay, all right, thank you. I just was worried that it wasn't gonna be in there, because the main concern was this, with it going to the.
If we can figure out a way not to have complaints. But yes,
There
it resides in another policy. Along with how you file complaints, you get anything in the district. Okay, are we ready to recommend this out for first reading or introduction?
Yes.
Astrid, are you supportive of sending this to the full?
I am, yeah.
Okay, great. So another, another one for January 9th. So I'm gonna move around in the agenda, just for housekeeping, a little bit, just to check. Kara, we have, two policies out for first reading, diversity and employment. And then naming school district property. Have we had any public comment on those?
No.
Okay. And then what about any public comment on the rescission for the strategic plan?
No.
Okay. So just for what it's worth, if we had public comment on something that's already out, that's been introduced, we would have a discussion about whether we want to change or recommend a change to the policy based on, like, if we got a suggestion, like you should change this section around or add this language, we have that discussion now. So we always, when we have things out for public comment, we ask in the committee, we can change them. But since there's no comment, we're good. And then we still have 3 policies out for
Schedule.
that we've already moved out of committee, but they need to be that we first read tomorrow. Right, tomorrow night. Great, and then we'll start with the review period. So at least 3 things on the agenda. And in our policies for revision, discussion, and possible action, we also had the school initiation and school closure policy. The last meeting, Director DePass had some language she wanted to offer to add in terms of like impacted schools. She has sent the language, but I can't differentiate on the red line which are her changes. In addition, Director Scott sent a host of questions and some things that he's for and against in the proposed policy. He I don't know, has he joined us?
No.
But I might have time for 5. So I'm going to suggest we move that to the next meeting, and what we'll do is we'll bring in a red line version where we can see Director DePass's proposed changes, and then we'll also have it set up. I can take Director Scott's comments and marry them to sections so that when we get to that section, we can have a discussion about his comments. Does that work?
Yeah, that works too. Yeah, there's a lot of things in there that I also want to talk about as well. So you have a whole meeting.
Okay, well, I'm not sure you get a whole meeting, but
Yeah. More time.
so I'm gonna suggest that, and then Kara, just for planning purposes, how many people are signed up for public comment?
We usually don't have any signed up for public. The one person we had has canceled.
That's weird, because I know somebody who submitted today and was told that there wasn't a spot for
I responded to them. They got the autoresponder because public comment is full for tomorrow. And so I think there was confusion. So I responded, but they said they're no longer available.
them. Oh, shoot. Interesting.
I'm sorry about that, getting the committee regoing, but after we shut down for a month, so I apologize if anybody wanted, we always will have public comment, so apologies. There's some fire. So no public comment. Okay. I guess I would say if anybody wants to provide public comments, I'm happy to allow it. Do you have any issue? Does anybody want to provide public comment?
I think for a change, I might want to do it after I hear what you guys say,
You want to do it after the,
potentially, yeah, because
Okay.
I know I have a lot of questions about the materials that were published, and maybe those will be answered in your discussion, but if not, I may want to pose them as public comment.
okay. Great. So I'm assuming it's about the funding for staff.
Yeah, equitable credit funding of school staff.
Yeah, and probably what I'm gonna do, because we have, the materials were put together by Dr. Adams, who isn't here, and there's a foundation staff, is that, these are going to be, part of the foundational materials. We have a lot of other materials that have been generated over the last, 6 years on the topic. So I think if we don't answer them, what I'd ask is you like just send them to me and we'll get them answered. That's all right. So, the last topic on our, do you think you're gonna wanna comment, or do any of you wanna comment? Cause we give you the time.
You've heard from us.
Okay. All right, so for the last 6 years, we've had a whole series of discussion about funding of school-based staff and how we've done that for 25 years, and it's evolved as school funding have changed, and obviously as the Portland Schools Foundation morphed into All Hands Raised, then moved to the fund for PPS, and just how it was done. And over the last 4 years, there have been changes made in the process of how schools have funded staff when they needed to pay for it, which staff they paid for. There's been more transparency, and we have a process by which it now goes through actually a district process. And the concern still raised about the equity of some schools, communities purchasing or funding school-based staff, and the ability of other schools that don't have the same resources to be able to do that. And based on much of the discussion that happened last year,
For this year's.
yeah, so last year during the budget cycle, as we were having conversations about it, there was a suggestion that was then incorporated into the budget that we spend $8 million in the federal COVID money to provide all schools with some increment of funds, and it ranged, I think, between 125 to 150. That's my recollection. And schools submitted plans for how they'd spend the money. But it was probably the first year in my 20-something years of the district where all schools had what I would consider like some discretionary funds to spend, because, well, if you look at the charts on which we have that outlines how much money per student each student gets, is the schools that have the higher sort of per capita student funding. Most of the time that funding comes with very specific links to types of staff that have to be hired, and the type of program that needs to be delivered and who they're assisting, versus foundation raised funds often are considered more discretionary. So last year we had an unusual year. And if you look at the data, almost all schools added discretionary staff where they felt it was generally best used. So last year was somewhat different from any other of the last 20-something years in PPS, just in terms of resources that weren't for a specific purpose at a school. Is that, do I have that generally right? You're gonna be like the expert.
I'm so glad. I'm on a game show today. That's right. It's not my area of expertise, but I do.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when we look at the data, I think that's one thing we have to realize, that last year, the data just looks very different from previous years because we had resources that we've never had before. Now, that doesn't mean the board and the budget process couldn't say, we want to do something similar, although that was an extraordinary circumstance where we had $8 million. I've also never been in that position before. But it is, for me, it's worth noting, having been involved in this conversation for a long time, it was one of the first years that there wasn't a lot of schools saying, we didn't have the capability to, do X because we didn't have the funds, because often it's like schools, communities dividing, maybe a 0.2 to add it to make somebody full-time, or like a half-time EA. So I just want to acknowledge that. So what I'm trying to tee up is over the next probably 6 to 8 weeks of the committee discussion, that we talk through sort of general directions and what we'd like to do related to the topic, instead of coming up with like, here's a draft policy, try to define a goal, and then define what the current state is, which it has evolved over the years. And then I don't know if there is a 1-page, and then what the potential options menu could be for the board, for a board policy change. Ranging from just leave it the same to a very different model. And so that's how I wanted to tee up the conversation, I guess, since it's just you and I today, and along with the students. And I don't know how much background you have on this information, on this topic.
Not much.
Not much. Well, this is like 6 years of conversation about it. It's essentially just after ballot measure 5 in the late 1990s, because we had such huge budget cuts, the district allowed school-based foundations or PTAs to essentially raise money and use it to fund staff. And since then, and then if they raise the money, and a third of it would go into a general pot, and then that would then be distributed among other schools. And so these charts that you have here shows which schools have them. So the majority of schools don't have a robust, don't raise a lot of money. But there's a small group of schools, some that raise quite a significant amount of money. And then they generally are schools that don't get equity funding dollars or title dollars. And they essentially, keep 2/3 in their school, and the third go to the fund for PPS, and then it gets distributed out. But essentially, it is maybe a quarter to a third of the schools raising money, and keeping 2/3 of it among that smaller group, and then the 1/3 gets distributed out. And then there's some schools that don't have foundations, but they also, because of their student bodies, they don't receive these grants from the bank. So I tried to describe a draft policy goal without describing an outcome. Did I accomplish that?
I think so.
Does that work? Did you want the outcome that you're wanting first?
So I think you could do this different ways. You could say schools could still fund staff, but the district would need to ensure that there's still an equitable funding. So for example, if one school raised a certain amount of money, which is kind of what happened last year, it was like schools are raising foundation money, and then the district came in and brought other resources in. Which created greater equity. because the part of the reason why it's equitable now, it's not like a school raises and keeps 66%. Say they raise $200,000 and they keep 66%. The other schools don't get 66% of 200,000. So what I was trying to think is like, what is why are we spending all this time trying to do this work? And the point to me is that we ensure that school-based staff, which is the thing that is the most important driver of student achievement, is that we have an equitable basis for how those get funded and distributed. Without saying exactly,
Right. Yeah, makes sense.
those sort of things, it's like, it's not like foundations are bad, or PTAs are bad, or we just, we have a point of view about like who's on the fund board or anything like that. It's more like what is the point of the whole, why would we even be discussing this? Because
Mhm.
we want to have an equitable basis for how school staff is distributed. And if we had unlimited resources, it'd be easy, because we could just say whatever. I mean, I think it would be easy, because we say whatever the wealthiest school, raises, we'll just match at it for everybody else on a per capita basis. And we take equity, but we don't. So. But I would welcome if you want to suggest revised language on what the purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty strong opinion about this.
Well, this is a place to express it.
But I mean, the current system we have is just, it's on the opposite, just, it's very cumbersome. The fact that you raise this, and then we also have equity funding formula and everything like that. So we're moving money around, and some schools raise more money, so we move more money around this way, and it's just like, it's so inefficient. And in many ways, in terms of like, you have these wealthy schools that are able to raise most money. And I also feel it's kind of disrespectful for those families, because all the effort they're putting in to raise this amount of money, they're the ones who are the most resourced, the most well-connected, that if their fundraising abilities were focused on district-wide, just there's a lot of evidence, and I believe that they will probably be able to raise even more money. It's just, like this whole thing, like, yeah, I think this whole thing started with Measure 5 back in 1990, right? And so, money moved out, and so they were, allowed local control, local abilities to raise, but that's an antiquated system. It's just kind of, and not only that, but it also raises a lot of misinformation. Like, for example, a lot of people believe that, I've talked to families too, that they believe that they need to put all this effort to raise money, or they're not going to get EAs for their school. And that's just a horrible feeling for a parent to have. Like, I don't know. I just feel like the option number one that we have here, maintain the current system, is an absolute no for me. Right. I feel like a central foundation would be a compromise. In terms of being able to still like treat all those families that are able to raise money. I mean, they're incredible assets. But I see your point, like not just describing the outcome, and then, but yeah, the policy needs to, which, adds another layer of complication. I don't know, it'd be a fun challenge though, but yeah. That's my piece. I could talk about this for hours. That's my summary.
Yeah, no, thanks, Eddie.
Andrew?
I'm sorry, I didn't join earlier, and I just joined now. But I think I joined at the beginning of the foundation policy discussion. I mean, Eddie, I think you framed things, well, in terms of some of the issues with the current system. I think I'm sorry, I actually haven't had a chance. Did this just get out of the board book, or was it in there earlier? I might have missed it earlier, but I haven't had a chance to go through this document. I think though, I mean, Eddie, one of the challenges for me, because I also agree that I think there are aspects of the system that need to be reformed. I think what's interesting when you say that we could raise a amount of money, the foundation people will tell you in no uncertain terms, raising money for your school is much easier than raising money for the district. And I think that's where the challenge for me comes into, if we believe that from a values basis some reform is needed, how do we reform things in a way that doesn't do damage, right? That actually improves equity, that actually improves, the district overall. And one of the things that I've been really worried about is that if we, if I don't think we're in danger of rushing into anything anymore, but we've been talking about it for a long time. But if we make a change that hasn't really been thought out, we could end up losing, $2, $3, maybe even $4 million of private money that's currently being raised, that is supporting our students. And I think that, for me, that's the biggest concern. How do we harness all that energy that you just talked about of folks coming together and raising money and doing really good work? How do we harness that for the good of the entire district? And I think it's a really hard policy question, to be blunt, right? And the potential unintended consequences are pretty serious and significant. The other thing that I struggle with that, is we, and this is really challenging. We have more of an equity focused funding model in this district than I think almost any other district that I'm aware of. I mean, I'd be interested in doing a little bit of benchmarking, but when you look at what we send per capita to our, neediest schools versus what we send per capita to our higher income, less needy schools, it is a dramatic difference. And so when you talk to the parents in these schools that are raising money for that EA, I mean, they wouldn't get the EA because they don't have the resources for it. And they're saying, hey, look, we added an EA. We also have underserved students at this school as well that are benefiting from this. Like you've already directed thousands of dollars more to the other school. Why are you taking away the pennies that we're sort of raising around the edges? And to me, that is a powerful argument. So is the argument around the inequities of this system. And meeting with the folks who want reform, I was really moved by the fact that, this is when you look at systemic, inequities in a district, this is part of it. And I was really moved by the fact that I didn't realize Portland was an outlier, right? I didn't realize that, there are not a lot of the districts that allow this sort of fundraising for FTE. And so anyway, I just continue to find myself in this sort of what I'm going to call a middle space of feeling the need to make some changes, but being very cautious, wanting to be very cautious about the changes we make, and not villainizing any of the community on either side. And that's the last thing. I'll be quiet and mute myself again. I'll probably go off camera. But what's really troubled me about this debate is how divisive it has become. Right? That instead of a conversation about how do we meet, I think what our shared goals are is to have the most equitable district and provide the best thing we can for all of our kids. It's become this issue of like, are you, for private fundraising, that is benefiting, wealthy, privileged kids, or are you for taking away that fundraising, doing other things? And you can see it on social media. It just gets very, very ugly very quickly. And so anything we do, I think needs to be really intentionally focus on facilitating that community conversation so that we can be bringing the sides together to get to an outcome that everyone agrees is the right one to move forward with. And that's what's really challenging. So I haven't read your document, Julia, but thanks for trying to put something together that sort of meets that middle ground.
I hope when you have a chance to look at it, Andrew, that I did try and have it be a neutral platform of like what the levers are, like what we're trying to accomplish by if we make any changes, and then sort of run through the different scenarios or levers that could be mixed and matched. Like I say, last year was a unique year, and I think that's the environment in which we just have more resources, and we're able to allow all schools have discretionary dollars to do things that they may not have, even if they're a high per capita school funding. Lots of times that money is pretty much prescribed of how they spend it, and then that middle band of schools generally doesn't have it. And then depending on where you are in the sort of private, how much money your school raises, you may get to be do a little or a lot of it. I mean, I was just looking through the data from 2019 and I mean, there's a pretty big spread between, you know, even like the top couple schools and then the next tier, and then there's just, you know, very little under that. So I look forward to you looking at it and you can tell me if I missed anything, but I tried to present it in a neutral way. And, you know, I'm interested in also your thoughts on like, what is the goal of the policy? Because the reality is the whole like 1/3, 2/3 split isn't even in the district policy. It's in that memo from the mimeographed
It's an old
memo from whatever 1997. So like I say this is the start of the discussion. I tried to capture the current state where are the leverage points or the main sort of policy choices that have already been made. Whether it's, you know, how if we put any limits, which we don't, like the proportion, whether, you know, we have any sort of rules about non-staff fundraising, which we don't generally. Any school can raise as much money as they want for all the other things, and they don't share any of that. So anyway, just looking at this is really a document designed to look at where, you know, where some policy choices are made, and then also hopefully generating some ideas around the sort of advocacy piece, which what I've found since 19 in the like around the 2000s, right after Measure 5, is there were thousands of PPS parents in Salem every legislative session, because while this was in existence, the reality is there was, through the Portland Schools Foundation, they were the convening and sort of catalyst for direct parent action. And so from my perspective, one of the things I'm interested in this conversation is like, how do you recapture that they, you know, had, you know, they were a large funder of the Coalition for School Funding Now, which was, you know, advocating like for the state school fund, which was for, and like joining with parents and staff from lots of other districts, which is sort of not outside of what we're you know doing right now.
Yeah, you know, that I'll be honest, that argument has always fallen a little flat for me, that because we allow certain schools to buy one EA for their school, that they're not advocating for state funding reform. And then the alternative of that, which is that I often hear like, oh, if we just change this policy, all those families would go down to Salem and we could change the world. I think there are lots of other reasons to do this. That one always, I don't know, that one seems, I don't see a whole lot of evidence for that. I think there's lots of other reasons why people aren't down advocating that we should talk about, but I don't think it's the fact that we allow like half of a librarian, you know, at a particular school that has sort of diminished the appetite for lobbying down in Salem.
I mean, the other thing that's changed is also there used to be a fair amount of more school-based support for our local options and our bonds, and that pretty much was non-existent in 2019 and 2020. Just people like, I give to my own school foundation, which of course is the way that we pay for, well, obviously all our capital projects and some of our capital projects, and also, you know, 800 teachers. Anyway, so to me, this is like another place where that discussion occurs. Like, how do we have a convening and gathering place where we collectively are working on that? So that's just my other issue. Gary, I see that you're on. Do you have anything you want to add?
Oh, no, I'm just listening.
Is there any way to increase the volume on the speaker? a little
Uh,
bit?
I'm just listening at this moment. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay,
Just listen.
yeah, I'm just listening. Thank you though for calling on me.
I usually find you have an opinion. Do you have anything based on the discussion or that you want to add or
No, I've
questions you
just
have?
been silently following along.
Astrid?
Yeah, I'm also just trying to like follow.
I mean, there's some assumptions there, right? Like, for example, yeah, I get that maybe you could raise more money if it's for your local school. But there's been, successful districts that have raised a lot of money with district-wide foundations. Right? So it's not like a zero-sum game. It's not like we're comparing either all or nothing. And not only that, there's also, and Andrea, I hear your point about this debate being very divisive, and I think that's kind of where we need to problem solve about how do we treat the people who are, who maybe this change is most going to affect the way that they've been seeing funding, treat them as assets, because they are skilled at fundraising. They're the ones that are raising hundreds of thousands every year, and how to bring them into a district-wide foundation. I mean, that would be my goal. I'm just putting that out there, with their skill set and their abilities and stuff like that. So that would be kind of where I think we need to focus on the problem solving. And yeah, I do want to stay away from divisive because everyone's just trying to raise money for their kids. But I just feel like I don't, with a district-wide foundation and having the focus on one foundation, it allows us to be more, I would think, allow us to be more able to go after bigger donors, bigger people with more money, big businesses and stuff like that. And I don't know, it gets at this, it's also an ethics issue for me too. Like the current system we have, in a way, kind of promotes a little bit of tribalism. I don't, like people go crazy about their high schools, and that's great, but we are also one district or one city. I don't know. I hear your points. I agree with them, but I think we also need to problem solve and figure out how to move forward so that we don't, without having a lot of, fears or assumptions kind of hinder us without it being based on like evidence. And I'm not saying it's not based on evidence, but I think the evidence is kind of all over the place from what I've seen. So yeah, it's kind of my response.
So obviously the superintendent proposes a budget, but I'm curious about for the board members here, the probability that there's going to be district funds to in the future to provide that smoothing that happened this past year. I mean, obviously not $8 million, but is that something that you foresee?
Are you referring to the ESSER funds?
Right.
Okay.
I mean, because it allowed
Right.
all schools to be able like, hey, we want that exclusive psychologist for another half, we're gonna put it, even though the district gave us like a 0.5, we're gonna add another 0.5, or we really, we didn't get another, EA or teacher, even though our classes were the highest, we wanted like fund to have an EA. So schools had that chance to do it, so that ESSER money kind of took some of the, well, they get to do that, but we don't, because we don't have that money, because now everybody had some money.
Yeah. And can I want to add on to that question a little bit as well. Like, because when I was talking to some district leaders, I was under the impression that like and maybe there's something we need to revisit the equity funding model a little bit. That the calculations were done after the foundation money came in, you know, for example, let's say, I'm just gonna throw out an example, let's say Lincoln raised $200,000. And so the equity funding, the eventual distribution of where money goes where would take that into account, right? And then distribute it accordingly. So in an alternate universe, if Lincoln never raised 200,000, then the formula would have, you know, taken that account as well. And they would have, you know, maybe district-wide, there'd be total less EAs, but they would have about the same number, right?
So
I think I just confused myself, so I don't.
No, I think I know what your question is, but I think that actually, I mean, my understanding is,
I don't know the answer to this question.
my understanding is the equity,
Yeah.
the equity formula happens before the foundation. So the foundation
Okay,
is just a separate add-on.
Staffing happens pretty early in the budget cycle, so that would be my.
Yeah, so it happens like in February, so it goes out, and it goes out based on the staffing manual. And then there's the equity formula to base, depending on the students that are being served at their school, so that
Mhm.
formula drives it.
Right.
And then essentially principals get their staffing formula, they do their magic, but you know,
Right.
some of it's like, it's clear, you've got, you know, say 15 classrooms, you know, get X number of teachers. And generally, the schools that have foundations are raising money during that time period, and then when sort of things settle out and they see what they have, then they can make those decisions, and sometimes they're like, we gotta hurry up and raise another, you know, X amount if we wanna add 2 more EAs, or I think we're good, or
yeah, right.
but that happens at
Makes
the
sense.
back end after.
Wouldn't it be kind of like, you always expect certain schools to raise certain money, so you, I mean, because it's people who decide how much money goes where, right?
Well, so, the staffing manual is pretty prescriptive. You have X number of people for every, you know, this number of students, you get, say, in elementary, you get this many,
Yeah.
you get this many PE teachers or this many art teachers. So that, it's very much a formula,
Okay,
obviously, because class sizes aren't all the same, so for
Right.
example, you might have, you know, a third grade at. There, you know, 30 students, and it may be okay. The staffing formula is not gonna give us an EA or another teacher, because it's not over the amount, but
right,
we're gonna raise the money to get an EA. If we
yeah.
have the
See,
capability to do that.
and like, it kind of adds to the other issue I have, like, you know, my kid goes to schools that are in the middle. Well, we don't raise any money, but we're not
You don't get any of the.
Title
grants
I
either.
or and other stuff, and so it's kind of like you have on one side, you have. You know, I'm just gonna use example because I'm in Southeast, right? You have Dunaway and Llewellyn raising a lot of money. And, you know, then you have us like Woodstock, Lewis and stuff that are kind of in the middle, like stuck in the middle, but we don't get, so like. I mean, it just makes it some more complicated because of that. Anyways, to kind of going back to your question, so are you asking kind of the way we've been doing, the way because of the ESSER funds, we have, I don't know what you call it, discretionary funds for every school and they get to use it.
That was $8 million, so
$8 million,
it's a lot.
right?
So I don't know, Andrew or Gary, whether you think just the long-term prospects of there being the smoothing function from district resources.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in. I mean, I think it's great if we have the resources, right? And I agree with your comments. I think I heard right as I was logging in, Julia, that I think this year we did hear less from communities because they had that discretion and you know, from what we were hearing, they were having those conversations at the building level with their principals and their parents and their teachers about how to spend those funds. So I think that was really positive. My caveat and caution is with $130 million of cuts over the next 3 years, it may be really challenging. You know, and I think an interesting, I mean, the trade-off is going to be, do we make an additional $8 million of cuts in order to provide that additional discretion and flexibility? And the answer to that might be yes, but it may be no. I think that's something that the board is going to really have to weigh as we go through the budget cycle. But I'm very much in favor of it if there's a way we can sort of carve it out, just with those caveats.
Gary?
Ditto.
I think it's just here. Oh. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, but it is kind of like, flat. I mean, everyone gets the same amount of money, that's kind of what happened with the ESSER funds, right?
So if you assume that the
I have
district
the
has,
data right here, right? Good.
if you assume the district has already said. We have a formula and there's an equity component to it
Mhm.
that. You can say we have an equitable funding formula, but then what you do is then we have this. Like $3 to $4 million that was added. In not an equitable fashion, so in some way, what the. The additional funds do is. Doesn't restore the equity, because then you're. On a balance, but it gives everybody the.
I mean, I'd be for exploring that for the main reason that. It is in a way. The fact that it's kind of flat may not be equitable, but at the same time. It could be equity because every school kind of has different needs. So having them have this kind of. Slush fund, little extra money to for them to determine where it goes. Is kind of like letting every school decide where that would be best used, right? You know, just because every school has different.
I mean, if you look at some of the things that schools bought, I mean, it's really.
Yeah.
Different.
All over the place.
By school. And some of the things that they got from the district and the things that they.
So I would just suggest that we make, if we're gonna do it, make it consistent, so it doesn't, so you don't have like. Like hire another CTE teacher 1 year and then have to fire them because the funds are gone. Right? You know. Kind of hopeful.
Yeah. Probably what they would do. This is like the principles is like. Oh, it's a 0.75 versus like a 1. I mean, which is a lot of times what they're adding, they're not actually adding. A whole
Yeah.
person.
See that.
Or anything, somebody else.
Person.
Pardon?
Add a whole person.
Well,
Yeah, I think.
it's adding.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you talk to principals, how they just do it, it's usually like, I'm short this. And I'd love to have that person be full-time. Or not traveling between schools. So the other question I had. The districts, so I'm gonna collect any other questions, Gary, you have, or Andrew or Gary. One of the questions I have is coming out of bargaining. It's my understanding that there was a commitment, although it's not necessarily in an article, that schools that don't currently get equity dollars, but have diverse students. That there was some sort of agreement. Does this sound familiar?
There was a lot of stuff discussed in those waning hours, which was I actually don't, I'm happy to get the answer, but I don't.
Do you know what the issue I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
I know what you're talking about. I don't think it made it to the final contract.
Well, it was more of a staffing issue, which we didn't put into didn't put those things into the contract, but I know it was discussed because one of the arguments that are made by schools that raise their own money sometimes is that they have underserved students, but they don't get any equity dollars because it's more of like a cliff, or it's a hard
There
line,
may
so.
be something there. I need to go, but I do know what it is. and I
Yeah.
just don't know the answer. I haven't seen the cleaned up version of the agreement yet. They've been working through that. So let me go find out and report back.
And then the other thing that could impact this is. So that's primarily a high school issue, I think. And the middle schools, although there's not very many middle schools that raise a fair amount of money. I mean, there's a couple, but not there. It's generally elementary and then a couple of the high schools. But the middle schools, the contract, because of the planning time, there's gonna be more art, music, and PE, because that's how the schools get planning time, so, which are things that had been purchased or may free up some resources at the middle school level. So that was a commitment to put more resources into the middle school, so. We just see how that plays out. The one thing about the data that I'm gonna ask for is this is, or this chart, but to have the. And we have this, just needs to be condensed, but to take this as the FTE 2023, 24 and add in the 22, 23. So you have a,
So dollars per student? Well,
no,
it's a
this like
different
this,
answer.
because 23 with 24 is really not a very representative year, so you get some of the trend lines. So for example. Like this is a chart that has 18, 19, 19, 20. And then 22, 23, 24. Just so you can get a sense given of what. So say if there's another $8 million to smooth everything out, then like what do things actually look, what do things actually look like? So that we just have that data.
So if you had a new 8 million, you would compare it to a prior year when you didn't make it, instead of comparing it to a year when you did.
Right, because if you look at this right here, it's like, oh, like all schools added FTE, but that's because we had $8 million. So if you go back to these other years,
How many of these columns that are 23, 24 do you want added for 22, 23? Or do you want an entirely different, do you want an entirely different document that's 22? Just make sure I ask for one.
so I think as long as we keep it labeled, what I would think is what we would want to see, and I say, I know Renard created this for us before, but is primarily these columns.
22.
Right. My recollection is with when you did this is from 2019, is that there was maybe 10 or 11 schools that bought more than one FTE. Which is like, how big of a problem is this? I mean, some bought a lot, so it's like, well, that's a lot, but other years it's like, oh, it's not that much. So maybe, you know, like this, and so one of the policy questions here would be, you know, do you want to say it's okay to raise funds for one FTE? And after that, there's just one centralized fund. But I think having that the other data gives us a sense of just like the scope.
Yep, I'll go ask.
And I can grab out of here like an example from.
I think I got what you
Exactly.
told me. I mean, you're gonna need all three of these. I can ask.
Do you, the community members who are here, do you want to state what your questions are? Or do you want to just send them to us? If you have questions about the data.
Yeah. I think the questions about the data we probably said, and the is probably best. There was one thing, clarifying about, I remember when the ESSER funds were distributed, there was some delineation between using those, if you had a foundation that was purchasing FTE, the ability to use those ESSER funds, and I can't remember, I was looking for that language and I can't remember
It
it.
definitely existed as something like if you purchased an FTE, you had to use your ESSER money for you could only buy up to or fund up to a 0.75, I think it was what it was.
All right.
Well, it's a noble fact. So we can get that because I think that's
think it's relevant. I was reading this and being like, wait a minute, looks like all of these schools have both. And I couldn't remember what the.
Cause they were allowed to still, but they could. It's not that they got less money. They just couldn't use it on, all of it on FTE is my recollection, but we can get that.
Then I'd be curious what they used it on, if not FTE. Let's see if there was anything else that wasn't, there was questions, but not specifically. Yeah, most of these are questions that we can send you on the data. Yeah, that's true. I can, the one question is that the foundation dollars listed on these documents don't match the foundation dollars that the Fund for PBS published. And so I'm wondering where the difference is there. Like, for example, Lincoln's is listed at $232,000 last year, and this has 77,000.
Okay, so tell me which column.
Okay, so if I'm looking at this, this blue, this one, the 23-24 selected funding sources. So pages aren't numbered. So if I look at Lincoln in the column, the 23-24 total, or I'm sorry, 23-24 foundation, it shows $77,291. But on the published document from the Fund for PPS, it shows that they raised $232,000.
So is this just reflecting money that was actually spent, and are they holding over money, or where is that discrepancy coming?
Sorry, so you're saying 23-24, Lincoln had a total of 77,000, but in the fund for.
Well, I guess actually one more clarification. So if this is the dollars used to purchase FTE for the 23-24 school year, my assumption is that then those are funds that were raised in the 22-23 school year. That's how it works, right? You raise money in one year for FTE in the following year.
Right, the new process is you pay forward.
Right, and so actually, if I looked at one that was a affiliated, it might be more straightforward, because I know that there's still transition going with the independent foundations. So like Buckman is another example where on this document it shows in the 23-24 foundation column $27,737, but on the document from the Fund for PPS it shows that they raised that they raised $108,000, kept $75,000 last year in the 22-23 school year for funding this year's staff.
So I'm gonna ask you to put your questions in writing, and I think Robin would probably be the best person to answer that question about on the data and
It
why.
makes it seem like they're all not raising as much money as they're actually raising according.
Well, it's actually it's about half and half. Some of them are higher in this document and lower in that, and some of them are the other way around. It was like, I haven't seen my painting yellow highlighted. And then the other big thing I just do want to say publicly is that the thing that feels very confusing to me on this document is that, like, I think we've all hashed it out that these are, when you look at these columns showing the total FTE, that these are, it's not the total FTE. Like Buckman did not get 9 additional FTE. That's maybe the portions of these positions that were contributed to. Like, Buckman didn't get 3 dance teachers paid for between their 3 full-time dance teachers between foundation and ESSER dollars, I'm assuming. So maybe that was, I don't, the way that these are broken down is confusing to me, but I think the big thing I want to be clear on is that we did not raise the number of total FTE in the district by 289 extra staff through these dollars, correct?
1.0.
So they're not, these numbers don't each reflect 1.0 FTE. They reflect maybe the number of bodies that were boosted, where the FTE was boosted, or
because then it makes it look like we would risk losing 289 staff positions across the district if we didn't come up with a 2 point whatever million that Andrew brought up. Sorry, Director Scott brought
I
up,
don't remember.
when in reality, it's not that many full-time positions, it's that many parts of positions, and that makes a big difference when figuring out how much you would have to replace that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this document, when you cross-reference, it's like, okay, so the total here is 27.23 total FTE. But when you look here, that was paid for between foundation, so this column, the total column here does not include ESSER FTE though, correct? On the heat map one, that's only foundation and parent fund funded positions.
So,
So
8 million.
So if I'm looking there, that 27.23 FTE is equivalent to what on this sheet is listed as 106 FTE when you combine the foundation and parent fund columns. So it's it reads as a highly overstated.
You're just talking about the total for foundations?
Yeah.
About 1.6 million. That's what selected funding sources paying for staff in schools.
so having agreement on the numbers is always an important exercise. So I would ask you to label these, this is document for the meeting, and then the whatever fund materials you're talking about. And copy your set of questions, because even if you just took the ESSER dollars, it's 183, and that would be 183 staff, an average of $47,000 per FTE, which
Yeah, but it ends up being more than that, right? Once you pay into,
Yeah, and this,
isn't a higher cost the district more than 47,000?
Yeah, I thought it was
So,
somewhere in the neighborhood of
120
125.
something.
yeah, well, I'm just saying, if you take 8 million and divide it by 183, which is what they say the ESSER dollars,
Yeah.
so it doesn't.
It doesn't work out, it doesn't work out.
Well, and this also doesn't say 8,000 for the ESSER dollars. Oh, yeah, it does, sorry, I was looking, oh yeah, ESSER, on this sheet, it says 6,025,000.
But that's probably because some schools spent that on non.
Right, so this is just what was spent on FTE.
So cover your questions, I think, again, having, and I also think because last year was just a year that was unlike any other year, we obviously should take it into consideration, but also look at the other years in which what was happening, pretty much year over year, which was fairly constant. We'll go from there.
All right.
Anything else?
Yeah, we'll just send that stuff. I appreciate that this conversation is happening and want to talk about that value as well of having an equitable policy that moves us forward on the books instead of a complex, outdated, inequitable policy, regardless of and whether that outweighs the financial question.
Thanks for coming. You speaking?
yeah, it's doing the math.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
There's a formula for figuring out the staffing, the equitable staffing formula, right?
Right, it's in the
There's a way
staffing
that it's
manual.
figured out. Doesn't the foundation fundraising work directly against that formula?